Oreth had watched 17 survey drops in the 8 years he had commanded Station Vethara 3. He had watched 2 of them end in body recovery. He had watched 4 abort inside the first 12 hours. He was, by his own count, not easily surprised by what the Vethara Reach could do to a living thing. He began revising that count on the second hour of the human's drop. Her name was Lena Marsh. She was 20 years old. The intake record classified her as a civilian survey specialist attached to the Terran-Varesi Joint Wilderness Research Accord, which was a diplomatic way of saying that humanity had agreed to let one of its young walk alone into one of the most hostile surface environments cataloged in the sector, in exchange for 17 species worth of geological and biological survey data that no automated probe had survived long enough to collect. The Reach had eaten 9 probes in the last decade. It had opinions about machinery. Oreth had reviewed her file before the drop. It had listed her height, 1.68 standard meters, slight build, her training certifications, a field experience log that ran to 14 separate wilderness classifications, and a biometric baseline that the station medic, Thesu, had noted with 2 words in the margin: anomalous parameters. Heart rate, blood oxygen tolerance, the distribution of muscle fiber density across her legs and shoulders. Not combat modifications. Just the body of a thing that had spent its life moving through hard terrain. She had smiled at the drop bay door before she stepped through. Not a performance, not nerves. Oreth had seen the footage 4 times since. It was a smile that said the planet already had her full attention and that she was glad of it. He had found that unsettling in ways he could not yet name. The first 18 hours were, in the survey log's clinical language, unremarkable. She made 12 kilometers into the Reach's interior on foot, moving at a pace the station's motion tracker read as deliberate, slower than a trained Varesi scout, faster than a machine-assisted route-finding team. She did not fight the terrain. The Vethara Reach's surface is a compound geography, eroded canyon systems overlaid with dense biochemical canopy, punctuated by spore field clearings that the local apex fauna, the Kethvoras, use as territorial markers. Every previous survey team, those that had not aborted, had attempted to navigate around the spore fields. They lost time, lost trail coherence, and eventually lost their nerve in the deep canopy where the thermals died and the Kethvoras moved without sound. Lena Marsh did not navigate around the spore fields. She walked through them, slowly, with her breathing mask adjusted and her pace dropped to something barely faster than a rest state. The first field took her 40 minutes to cross. Oreth had watched with his hands flat on the monitor housing, not moving, reading her oxygen saturation and her heart rate, waiting for the numbers to climb the way they always climbed when something encountered the Reach's interior at close range. The numbers did not climb. Her heart rate was 56. Thesu had come in from the medical bay and stood at his shoulder without being asked. "She's not reacting to the spore load," Thesu said. "I can see that." "That is not possible." "I can see that too." The second spore field she crossed in 31 minutes. The third she crossed in 28. Oreth spent the fourth crossing running the atmospheric filter data backward, checking whether the station was receiving a clean transmission from her biomonitor or whether the signal had degraded. The signal was clean. Her heart rate had moved to 54. He logged it and said nothing to the Accord representatives on the station's upper level, who had begun their own quiet watch of the relay screen. There were 4 of them, 2 Varesi biologists and 2 Terran liaisons, who were technically not supposed to be in the monitoring bay at all, but had stopped pretending they were elsewhere after the third spore crossing. One of the Terran liaisons, a broad-shouldered man named Carr, had said, "She knows what she's doing," and then gone back to watching the screen as if the observation needed no further commentary. Oreth had found that equally unsettling. Hour 23 brought the first Kethvora's contact. The Kethvoras are not ambush hunters. That is their most dangerous quality. They are persistence hunters, large, four-limbed, covered in the same green-scaled hide that absorbs the Reach's mid-spectrum radiation and makes them thermally invisible to standard scanning at ranges below 80 meters. They do not charge. They follow. They have followed things across 40 kilometers of broken terrain and waited for the exhaustion to do the work. Every previous team that had encountered them on foot had done the same thing. They had run. The Kethvoras had followed. The outcomes of that interaction were in the recovery logs. Lena Marsh did not run. The biomonitor showed her stopping. Heart rate 61. Elevated, yes. She had detected the Kethvoras before the station's own ground sensors picked up the contact signature. But 61 was a number associated with a human walking uphill, not a human recognizing a 400-kilogram persistence hunter at 60 meters in a spore canopy clearing. She sat down. Orath replayed the sensor data 3 times before he accepted it. She had sat down on a rock formation at the edge of the clearing, taken out a water filtration unit, and begun filtering water from the standing pool at the formation's base. The Kethvoras entered the clearing at 40 meters and stopped. It was, behaviorally, an unprecedented contact event. The survival records contained no instance of a Kethvoras stopping mid-approach on a stationary target. They were designed, functionally, to respond to flight. They had no recorded behavioral template for a target that did not provide flight. The Kethvoras waited. Lena Marsh filtered water for 11 minutes, drank, refilled the unit, and then walked in a route that took her to the clearing's northeast edge, away from the Kethvoras without hurry, without the straight-line urgency that triggered pursuit. The Kethvoras tracked her for 4 minutes. Then it turned and moved back into the spore canopy. Nobody in the monitoring bay spoke. Then the Veresi biologist beside Orath said, very quietly, "How did she know?" It was not a question. Orath did not answer it as one. She read the environment, he said. She understood what the animal needed from her in order to follow, and she declined to provide it. The biologist looked at him. She is 20 years old. Yes. And she knew that. Orath checked the biomonitor, heart rate 58. She has always known that, he said. The second Kethvora's contact came at hour 31. 3 animals this time, moving on a coordinated spread through the lower canyon system. She had entered to reach the geological survey target. The station tracked their heat-wake patterns closing from 3 directions, and Orath had reached for the emergency extraction call when he stopped and looked at her biomonitor again. Heart rate 63. She had gone still in the shadow of a canyon overhang, in a gap between 2 spore root formations too narrow for the Kethvoras to enter at speed, with her back to the canyon wall and her survey equipment laid flat across her knees. She waited. The Kethvoras moved through the canyon for 19 minutes. They passed her position twice. On the 3rd pass, one of them stopped at the gap entrance. Orath could see the thermal wash of it on the sensor relay, a massive heat signature simply existing at 2 meters from where she sat, and the gap was not large enough, and the Kethvoras was large enough, and Orath was running the survival probability metric in his head without wanting to. Her heart rate was 61. The Kethvoras moved on. She waited another 8 minutes after the last contact signature cleared the canyon. Then she continued to the survey target, collected the geological core samples the accord required, and logged the acquisition in the mission record with a note that the canyon's eastern wall showed secondary mineral stratification not on the original survey maps, which she had documented with imaging and included in the data packet. The geological note was 2 sentences. It was written in the same unadorned technical language as every other entry in her survey log. The Kethvora's encounter was not mentioned anywhere in the field record. Orath found this detail the most difficult thing he had processed so far, and he had been processing difficult things since the 2nd hour of the drop. He asked Carr about it at the end of the shift cycle. Carr had stayed in the monitoring bay for 16 hours without a break, which violated 3 separate station protocols that Oreth had stopped citing. She didn't log it, Oreth said. Carr looked at him with the flat, patient expression that Oreth had come to associate with humans explaining something they considered obvious. It wasn't a problem, Carr said. She handled it. You don't log non-events. 3 Kethvoras at combined close range is not a non-event. Every previous team that encountered a single Kethvoras at close range. Every previous team ran, Carr said. That made it an event. She didn't run, nothing happened. Why would she log it? Oreth did not have an answer. He went back to the monitor. Hours 40 through 62 were what the survey record would later designate as the primary data collection phase. She covered 37 kilometers in variable terrain. She lost her filtration pump to a chemical deposit and rebuilt a gravity filter from terrain materials and equipment mesh in under an hour. She crossed a fungal bloom that the station's bioteam had flagged as acutely toxic and emerged from it with her readings clean. The breathing mask had held, and she had walked through the bloom's center rather than around its edges, which were, she noted in a brief log entry, thicker with dispersal spores than the core. The bioteam had not known that. The station's survey database had not recorded it. She had read it from the ground. Thesu stopped coming to the monitoring bay and started watching from a personal relay in medical. When Oreth checked in at hour 50, Thesu said, "I've updated her baseline in the system. I want a record that what I'm reading is accurate for her. I don't want anyone looking at these numbers after she comes back and thinking the equipment failed." "The equipment is functioning within normal parameters," Oreth said. "I know," Thesu said. "That's what concerns me." The third and final Kethvora's encounter was at hour 68, 4 hours from the extraction point. 6 animals, moving on a coordinated pack formation that the Reach's ecological records listed as a Class A territorial response, the behavior pattern the Kethvoras reserved for incursions into the pack's core denning range. No survey team had ever triggered a Class A response and reached extraction. The last team that had tried had triggered an abort at first contact and had still lost 1 member at the extraction margin. Lena Marsh triggered the Class A response and kept moving. Not fast, not slow. The same pace she had held across 4 days of the Reach's surface, deliberate, terrain reading unhurried. The station tracked the Kethvoras on spread approach, and Oreth watched her biomonitor, and her heart rate was 67. And she moved through a narrow ridge line between 2 spore field corridors that the pack's own territorial mapping had left as a travel route because no prey item had ever used it as a deliberate line. It was not a flight path. It was not a clearance gap. It was simply a route through the terrain that a thing would take if it was navigating, not fleeing. She navigated it. The Kethvoras tracked her to the ridge entrance. The pack behavioral model had no classification for what they encountered, a target moving through their territorial core at moderate pace, not fleeing, not challenging, simply in transit, not prey behavior, not rival behavior. Something the model had no category for. They let her through. She logged the extraction point arrival at hour 71, 47 minutes ahead of the scheduled window. Her survey data package was complete. The core samples were intact. Her gear had incurred 2 field repairs and 1 replacement by fabrication, all documented in the maintenance log, all executed without calling the station. Her field notes ran to 412 entries covering geological, atmospheric, and biological observations across 37 linear kilometers of previously uncharted deep reach terrain. The Kethvora's encounter at hour 68 was not mentioned in the field notes. The 2 prior encounters were not mentioned in the field notes. Oreth checked 3 times. The extraction crew who brought her up said she fell asleep in the transport pod before they cleared the atmospheric boundary. He wrote his after-action report that evening. The Accord representatives had questions. They had many questions, and he answered them in order, and the answers were mostly numbers, because numbers were what he had. And the numbers did not explain anything except that a 20-year-old human from a Class 14 origin world had spent 72 hours in the Vethara Reach's interior alone, had encountered the Reach's apex pack hunters 3 times at close range, had navigated 11 spore fields, had lost and rebuilt critical equipment mid-deployment, and had logged 412 field observations. She had not called for extraction at any point. She had not triggered her distress beacon. She had not, as far as the survey record showed, experienced a moment she would have classified as an emergency. At the bottom of the after-action report, in the section designated for supplementary observations, Oreth wrote one additional note. He had not written a supplementary observation in 6 years of after-action reports. He was not certain he was writing it for the Accord, or for the station record, or for anyone who would ever read it. He wrote, "Recommend reclassification of Vethara Reach threat response protocols. The current baseline for survivable solo exposure was established against Varesi standard physiology and Varesi standard decision architecture. What we observed this week is neither. I do not have a classification tier for what we observed. The Reach did not break her. I am not confident the Reach could break her. I am not confident the Reach knew what it was dealing with. I am not certain I do either." He saved the report and went to find Carr. The Terran liaison was in the Bay canteen, drinking something hot, looking at nothing in particular. He looked up when Oreth came in. "She's resting," Carr said. "She'll want to look at the geological notes with the bio team tomorrow. She said she found something in the fungal bloom distribution that doesn't match the existing models." Oreth sat down across from him. He thought about asking what he actually wanted to ask, which was whether Lena Marsh had ever been afraid out there, and then he thought about the heart rate data, and he decided that was not quite the right question. "How many of your people," he said instead, "have her baseline numbers?" Carr looked at him for a moment. Then he wrapped both hands around his cup and said, "Enough." He did not say how many. Oreth did not ask again.